Welcome to Night Crime Stories. Tonight, we examine the case of the Tylenol Murders of 1982, where 7 innocent people reached for relief and found something far darker inside. A killer who was never caught. A nation that never felt safe again. Settle in, turn off the lights, and let the case unfold. Opening meditation. There is a particular kind of darkness that settles over a place after something terrible has happened there. Not the darkness of night, which is natural and familiar and ultimately passes. But a deeper darkness. A permanent shadow that changes the very quality of the light, even on the brightest afternoons. A darkness that the people who live there carry with them long after the cameras and the investigators and the journalists have packed up and moved on. The Algarve coast of southern Portugal is one of the most beautiful stretches of shoreline in all of Europe. The light there is extraordinary, golden and warm, the kind of light that photographers travel thousands of miles to capture. The sea is turquoise and clear. The white buildings glow in the afternoon sun. Families come there every year by the millions, drawn by the warmth and the beauty and the sense of safety that a well-worn holiday destination provides. But there is a small village along that coast, a quiet, unassuming cluster of villas and restaurants and narrow streets, that has carried a different kind of weight for nearly 20 years now. A weight that no amount of sunshine or ocean breeze has ever quite managed to lift. The name of that village is Praia da Luz. And the story we are going to explore tonight, carefully, methodically, with the seriousness and the gravity that it deserves, is a story that begins there, on a warm spring evening in the year 2007. A story that involves a little girl who was 3 years old when she disappeared. A story that has consumed investigators, journalists, legal scholars, and grieving families for nearly 2 decades. A story that, even now, in the year 2026, has not yet found its ending. Settle in. Take a breath. We have a long journey ahead of us tonight. And we are going to take it slowly, and carefully, and together. Part 1, The Village and the Night. To understand what happened in Praia da Luz in May of 2007, you first need to understand the place itself. Not just the geography, not just the architecture, but the particular social ecosystem that forms around a holiday resort community, the way that transient populations move through a fixed landscape, the way that routines develop among temporary residents, the way that a sense of communal safety can be both genuine and dangerously illusory. Praia da Luz is a small resort town on the western edge of the Algarve, the southernmost region of Portugal. It sits on a bay that curves like a cupped hand, with golden cliffs rising on either side and a wide, clean beach spreading out between them. The water is calm there, protected from the rougher Atlantic swells by the geography of the coastline. It is the kind of place that families return to year after year, building up a familiarity with the local restaurants, the walk down to the beach, the particular quality of the evening light as the sun drops toward the ocean. In May of 2007, one such family, a British family, traveling with friends who also had young children, was staying at the Ocean Club Resort in the center of the village. They had arrived on the 28th of April, settling into a ground-floor apartment in a low white building on the resort grounds. The apartment was comfortable and well-appointed, typical of the holiday accommodations that the resort provided to its seasonal guests. It had a rear patio that faced a central courtyard, and the courtyard gave access to a side gate that opened onto a street running along the back of the complex. The family had brought 3 young children with them on the holiday. The oldest was just 3 years old. In the evenings, the adults in the group had developed a routine over the course of the week. After putting the children to bed, they would walk to a tapas restaurant within the resort grounds, close enough to their apartment that they could keep an eye on the building and take turns checking on the children throughout the evening. It was the kind of arrangement that many parents might have made under similar circumstances, imperfect in ways that are only obvious in retrospect, but rooted in a reasonable assessment of the risk, or what seemed like a reasonable assessment. On the evening of Thursday, the 3rd of May, 2007, the routine proceeded as it had on previous evenings. The children were put to bed. The adults made their way to the restaurant. They shared a meal, they checked on the children at intervals, they enjoyed the kind of easy companionship that comes with a group of friends on holiday. At approximately 10 o'clock in the evening, one of the adults returned to the apartment for a scheduled check. The 3-year-old girl was not in her bed. She was not in the apartment. She was not in the courtyard. She was not anywhere in the immediate vicinity of the building. She was simply gone. What followed in the next few minutes was the kind of frantic, desperate searching that every parent's worst nightmare is made of. The immediate surroundings of the apartment were searched. The resort grounds were searched. Other guests were alerted. Staff were alerted. The local GNR, the Portuguese National Republican Guard, was called at approximately 10:10 in the evening. By the time the first officers arrived, it was already becoming clear that this was not a child who had wandered out of bed and gotten lost on the resort grounds. The apartment showed signs that someone had been inside, signs that would be debated and analyzed and argued over for years afterward, but signs that investigators would eventually conclude pointed to deliberate entry and deliberate removal of the child from the building. The window in the children's bedroom, a window with shutters that opened onto a side passageway running along the building, was found open. Whether it had been opened from inside or outside, and when, became one of the central contested questions of the investigation that followed. But on that first night, in those first frantic hours, the open window pointed in only one direction. Someone had taken her. The little girl's name was Madeline McCann. She was 3 years and 11 months old. She had been due to celebrate her 4th birthday just 4 days later, on the 7th of May. She has not been seen since that evening. In the days and weeks that followed, the disappearance of Madeline McCann became the most heavily covered missing child case in British history, and arguably in the history of international media coverage of missing persons cases anywhere in the world. The scale of the attention was extraordinary and, in some respects, unprecedented. Within days, her photograph was being published in newspapers around the world. Her parents, Kate and Jerry McCann, both physicians from the English Midlands, became instantly recognizable figures, appearing at press conferences, meeting with government officials, traveling to Rome to meet the Pope, doing everything in their considerable power to keep their daughter's face in front of the public and the pressure on the authorities to find her. The Portuguese authorities launched a major investigation, coordinated by the Polícia Judiciária, the country's criminal investigation police. British police from the Leicestershire Constabulary, whose jurisdiction included the McCann family's home, provided assistance and liaison. Interpol issued notices. Tips flooded in from across Europe and beyond. And yet, for all of the effort and all of the attention and all of the resources that were poured into the search, Madeleine McCann was not found. Not in those early days. Not in the months that followed. Not in the years that slowly accumulated and turned into a decade, and then into a decade and a half, and then into something approaching 2 full decades of absence. What remained, through all of those years, was a question. A question that her parents and her family and the investigators who never stopped working the case never stopped asking. What happened to Madeleine McCann? Part 2, The Early Investigation and Its Failures. Investigations of this kind, major criminal cases that unfold in high-profile, high-pressure environments with intense media scrutiny, face a particular set of challenges that more routine investigations do not. The scrutiny itself becomes a variable in the investigation. Decisions about what to reveal and what to withhold, about which leads to pursue publicly and which to work quietly, about how to manage the flow of information to a media that is hungry for updates on an hourly basis. These decisions consume investigative resources and create pressures that can distort the natural progress of a criminal inquiry. The Portuguese investigation into Madeleine McCann's disappearance was, from the beginning, fighting on multiple fronts simultaneously. There was the practical work of evidence collection and witness interviewing, which had to happen quickly in the first hours and days before memories faded and physical evidence deteriorated. There was the coordination with British authorities, which introduced jurisdictional and institutional complexities. There was the media management challenge, which was enormous from the first day. And there was the pressure from the Portuguese government itself, which was acutely aware that the eyes of the international community were on the country's investigative institutions. In those first critical hours, the response to the scene was not what it might have been. The apartment where Madeleine had been sleeping was not immediately secured and treated as a crime scene in the way that best practice would dictate. Well-meaning family members, friends, and resort staff moved through the space before forensic teams arrived, potentially contaminating evidence that might have been crucial. This was not a failure born of negligence so much as a failure born of the natural human impulse to search, to look, to do something in the face of a terrifying situation. But the consequences for the investigation would be significant and long-lasting. The lead detective assigned to the case by the Polícia Judiciária was an experienced officer named Goncalo Amaral. Amaral was a career detective with a substantial record of major case investigations, but he would become a deeply controversial figure in the McCann case, ultimately removed from the investigation, going on to write a book advancing theories that the McCann family vigorously disputed and successfully challenged in Portuguese courts, and becoming one of the most polarizing characters in a case that was full of them. In the early weeks of the investigation, the Polícia Judiciária pursued numerous lines of inquiry simultaneously. Sightings of Madeleine were reported from across Portugal, Spain, and Morocco. The proximity of Morocco across the Strait of Gibraltar made it an early focus of speculation that she had been transported out of Portugal by a trafficking network. A particularly compelling sighting was reported from the city of Marrakesh, where a woman reported seeing a blonde girl matching Madeleine's description being carried through the Medina. This lead, like so many others, ultimately could not be confirmed. Witness accounts from the evening of the 3rd of May began to accumulate, but they were fragmentary and sometimes contradictory, as eyewitness accounts always are under conditions of stress and uncertain timing. Several witnesses reported seeing a man carrying a child near the Ocean Club complex on the evening of the disappearance. One account, from a British family also on holiday at the resort, described a man walking with purpose through a street near the back of the apartment complex, carrying what appeared to be a child wearing light-colored pajamas. This sighting became one of the most significant pieces of witness evidence in the case, though it would take years for its full significance to become apparent. What the investigators did not know at the time, what they could not have known, because the information did not yet exist in connected form, was that among the people living in and around the village of Praia de Luz in the spring of 2007 was a man with a history of offending against children. A German national, living a transient and largely off-grid existence in the Algarve, who had been moving through the region for years. A man who, at that moment, was largely invisible to the investigation because the connections between the scattered records of his activities and the crime that had just been committed had not yet been drawn. It would take years for those connections to be established. Years of investigative work across multiple countries, involving multiple police forces and intelligence services, that would gradually assemble a picture of this man's life and movements and history. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Because before we come to the suspect, we need to understand what happened to the investigation in the years between the disappearance and his identification. We need to understand the wrong turns, the controversies, the moments when the case seemed to be moving forward only to stall again. We need to understand the full weight of the 19 years that have passed since Madeleine McCann disappeared from her bed. In September of 2007, 4 months after Madeleine's disappearance, the Portuguese authorities took a step that shocked the world and fundamentally altered the public perception of the case. They named Kate and Jerry McCann as arguidos, formal suspects, in the disappearance of their own daughter. The designation of arguido in Portuguese law carries specific legal implications, including the right to silence, and its use is not a formal accusation of guilt, but its public announcement was devastating to the family and created a narrative of suspicion that would follow them for years. The theory being advanced at this point by elements of the Portuguese investigation was that Madeleine had died in the apartment, possibly from an accidental overdose of sedative medication, and that her parents had concealed her death and staged an abduction. This theory was advanced with particular force by Goncalo Amaral, who published it in his book after his removal from the investigation, and who maintained it through years of subsequent legal battles with the McCann family. The forensic evidence that was cited in support of this theory centered on analysis performed by British forensic scientists from the Forensic Science Service. Cadaver detection dogs, highly trained animals capable of identifying the scent of human decomposition, had alerted to specific locations in the apartment and to the McCann family's hire car, which they had rented several weeks after Madeleine's disappearance. DNA analysis of samples taken from these locations produced inconclusive results. The lead forensic scientist, John Lowe, was careful in his report to note the limitations of the evidence, stating explicitly that the results could not support a definitive conclusion that the material came from Madeleine. In July of 2008, the Portuguese Polícia Judiciária officially shelved the investigation. The arguido status of Kate and Jerry McCann was lifted. The case file was closed, not definitively, but in the manner of an investigation that has exhausted its active leads. The McCann family, who had never accepted the theory of their own guilt and who would spend years fighting it through the courts, was left in the devastating position of having the official investigation into their daughter's disappearance concluded without resolution. For the next 3 years, there was no active official investigation into what had happened to Madeleine McCann. The family maintained their own private investigation, funded through the Find Madeline campaign and with the assistance of private detective agencies. They continued to appeal publicly for information. They continued to believe, and to say publicly, that their daughter had been taken by someone. Then, in 2011, everything changed again. Part 3, Operation Grange and the Metropolitan Police. In May of 2011, 4 years after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the British Home Secretary at the time, Theresa May, who would later become Prime Minister, announced that the Metropolitan Police Service would conduct a formal review of the case. The review, which was launched following a request from the McCann family and considerable political pressure from members of Parliament and the public, was framed initially as a review rather than a reinvestigation, a distinction that carries significant legal and operational implications. The Metropolitan Police Review was assigned to a dedicated team and given the operational name Operation Grange. The team was led initially by Detective Chief Inspector Andy Redwood, a senior and experienced investigator within the Met's Homicide and Major Crime Command. The scale of the review was substantial. The team would eventually examine thousands of documents, hundreds of witness statements, forensic evidence files, and investigative records from the original Portuguese investigation. They would conduct new interviews with witnesses and review intelligence that had accumulated in the years since the case was first opened. What Operation Grange found, when they began their systematic work, was both reassuring and troubling in equal measure. Reassuring, in the sense that the detailed re-examination of the original evidence did not support the theory that Madeleine's parents had been involved in her disappearance. The investigators, bringing fresh eyes and the full resources of one of the world's most capable police services to the review, found no credible evidential basis for the suspicion that had been directed at the McCann family in 2007. But troubling, in a different and ultimately more significant way, because the review revealed that the original investigation had not exhausted all possible lines of inquiry. There were witnesses who had not been fully interviewed. There were sightings that had not been fully traced. There were individuals in and around Praia da Luz at the time of Madeleine's disappearance whose backgrounds had not been fully investigated. The landscape of the case, when examined with fresh methodology and modern investigative tools, looked different from the landscape that the original investigators had mapped. By 2013, the review had advanced to the point where the Metropolitan Police announced that it had been elevated from a review to a full criminal investigation. Operation Grange was now a live investigative inquiry, with the authority and resources that designation entailed. British officers began traveling to Portugal to conduct new interviews and work alongside their Portuguese counterparts, who had reopened their own inquiry in parallel. The public announcement of the transition from review to investigation was accompanied by the release of new artist impressions of a man that the investigators wanted to identify and trace. The images, created using contemporary witness accounts that had been newly analyzed, depicted a man of specific physical description carrying a child on the night of the disappearance. The witnesses who had provided these accounts were the British family who had seen a man carrying what appeared to be a child near the Ocean Club on the evening of May 3. Operation Grange continued its work through the following years with a thoroughness and a tenacity that reflected the seriousness with which the Metropolitan Police had committed to the case. The team worked through hundreds of persons of interest, tracing individuals who had been in the Praia da Luz area in the relevant period, checking backgrounds, building out a picture of who had been present in that corner of Portugal in the spring of 2007 and what their histories showed. And then, in June of 2020, something happened that changed the entire direction of the investigation. German prosecutors, working from their own intelligence and investigative sources, publicly named a man as a suspect in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. The man was a German national. He was 43 years old at the time of the announcement. He had lived in Portugal for extended periods, including in the Praia da Luz area. He was currently serving a prison sentence in Germany for an unrelated offense involving the sexual abuse of a child. His name was Christian Bruckner. Part 4: The Man from the Margins. To understand Christian Bruckner, to understand how a man with his history could have existed in and around a well-traveled tourist community for years without drawing the kind of focused investigative attention that his background warranted, you need to understand something about the particular subculture of transient expatriate life in southern Europe in the first decade of the 21st century. The Algarve, in the years surrounding Madeleine McCann's disappearance, was home to a significant population of Northern European nationals who had made the region their home on a more or less permanent basis. Some were retirees, drawn by the mild climate and the relatively low cost of living. Some were seasonal workers in the tourism industry. And some were individuals who had found, in the loose regulatory environment of a region that catered to large numbers of transient visitors, a kind of anonymity and freedom from scrutiny that suited their particular needs and their particular histories. Christian Bruckner appears to have arrived in Portugal sometime in the early 2000s, making himself part of this expatriate community in ways that were, by most accounts, deliberately low profile. He lived in various locations around the Algarve over the years, including a property near Praia da Luz. He worked intermittently, in the tourist industry, in various casual capacities, and he supplemented his income through methods that were decidedly less legitimate. Bruckner's criminal history in Germany, which predated his time in Portugal, was substantial. He had been convicted of multiple offenses, including drug offenses and offenses involving the sexual abuse of children. These convictions were on record in Germany, documented in the German criminal justice system. But in the early 2000s, when Bruckner was building his life in the Algarve, the systems that would today allow for real-time cross-border checking of criminal records across European Union member states were not yet fully operational. A German national with a criminal record in Germany could, in those years, establish a new existence in Portugal without his background being immediately apparent to Portuguese authorities or to the communities in which he lived. It is important to be precise about what is known and what is alleged at this stage of the story. In 2009, 2 years after Madeleine McCann's disappearance, Bruckner was convicted in Portugal of the rape of a 72-year-old American woman. The assault had taken place in 2005, in a villa not far from Praia da Luz. He was convicted of this offense and sentenced to a prison term, but was subsequently released and eventually returned to Germany. In 2019, Bruckner was sentenced to a further 7 years in prison in Germany for the rape of a young woman in the United States in 2005. The complexities of international legal proceedings meant that this sentence was served in Germany, and it was while serving this sentence that he came to the attention of investigators in connection with the McCann case. The precise nature of the evidence that led German investigators to name Bruckner as a suspect in Madeleine McCann's disappearance has not been fully made public, for reasons that are entirely understandable given the ongoing nature of the investigation. What has been publicly disclosed is that phone data placed Bruckner in the Praia da Luz area on the night of May 3, 2007. Investigators also reportedly had access to communications, messages and other material, in which Bruckner allegedly made statements about the case and about the child that were regarded as highly significant. When German prosecutors made their announcement in June of 2020, they stated publicly that they were certain, their word, that Madeleine McCann was dead, and that Bruckner was responsible for her death. This was an extraordinary statement for prosecutors to make in the absence of a formal charge, reflecting a level of institutional confidence in their evidence and their analysis that was notable and, to some observers, surprising. The announcement, however, also carried within it the seed of a legal and diplomatic complication that would come to define the next phase of the case. Because German prosecutors, while certain of Bruckner's guilt, were not at that point in a position to bring charges. The evidence they had, while compelling in their assessment, had not yet met the threshold required for a German prosecution. And Bruckner himself, appearing through his legal representatives, denied any involvement in the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. His sentence in Germany was due to expire in 2025. The window for bringing charges, either in Germany or elsewhere, was finite. And the question of which jurisdiction would ultimately be responsible for prosecuting him, and on what basis, was about to become one of the most complex legal puzzles in the history of international criminal cooperation. Let us spend some time with what we know of Christian Bruckner's character and psychology, because understanding the man, to the extent that it is possible to understand a man about whom many things remain undisclosed, is essential to understanding the case. By the accounts of people who knew him during his years in Portugal, Bruckner was a man who inhabited the fringes of the expatriate community. He was described as someone who could be charming and engaging, but who also had a capacity for volatility and who was known to carry firearms, something that, in Portugal's relatively low-crime tourist communities, set him apart from the general run of expatriates. He was a skilled driver and mechanic, and he operated a camper van or motorhome during his years in the Algarve, a mobile existence that would have allowed him to move through the region with a flexibility and an inconspicuousness that a fixed address would not have provided. The motorhome is significant for another reason. Investigators looking at the geography of Praia da Luz and the logistics of removing a child from the area without detection have long focused on the question of how such a removal could have been accomplished. A motorhome, a vehicle large enough to conceal a child, mobile enough to move quickly, ordinary enough to attract no particular attention in a tourist area, would have provided exactly the means that such an operation would have required. Phone records, which were analyzed by investigators and which have been described in general terms in court proceedings and prosecutor statements, placed a device registered to Bruckner in active use in the Praia da Luz area on the evening of May 3, 2007. The records were said to show movement consistent with a specific route in and around the area where the Ocean Club Resort was located. None of this, taken individually, constitutes proof of guilt beyond reasonable doubt. Investigators and prosecutors are acutely aware of this. The question that has driven the subsequent years of investigation is whether the totality of the evidence, the phone records, the witness sightings, the material from Bruckner's communications, the broader picture of his history and his presence in the area, can be assembled into a case that meets the evidentiary threshold required for prosecution. That question, as of 2026, remains open. But the Metropolitan Police believe they are closer to answering it than at any point in the past 19 years. Part 5, The Architecture of Suspicion, Evidence and Analysis. Criminal cases that survive for many years without resolution develop, over time, a particular kind of evidential architecture. The structure is built from many different kinds of material: physical evidence, digital evidence, witness testimony, behavioral analysis, circumstantial connections, and the strength of any particular prosecution ultimately depends not on any single piece of that material, but on how the pieces relate to each other, how they reinforce each other, how they collectively build a picture that a jury can understand and find compelling beyond reasonable doubt. In the case of Madeleine McCann and Christian Bruckner, the investigators at Operation Grange and their German counterparts have been working for years to assemble exactly this kind of architecture. What we know about the structure of the evidence, assembled from prosecutors' statements, court filings, investigative disclosures, and the careful work of the journalists and legal analysts who have covered the case, gives us a framework for understanding what the investigators believe and why they believe it. Let us begin with the digital evidence, because it is in many ways the most concrete element of what has been publicly described. Modern telecommunications investigations rely heavily on the analysis of call data records, the detailed logs that mobile phone networks maintain of every call, text message, and data connection made or received by every device on their networks. These records include not just the fact of a connection but, crucially, the identification of which cell tower or towers the device was communicating with at the time of the connection. In areas where the cell tower network is dense, this information can locate a device to within a relatively small geographic area. In rural or semi-rural areas like the Algarve coast, where the tower density is lower, the precision is somewhat less, but the records can still establish that a device was in a general area at a given time. Investigators analyzing phone records from the evening of May 3, 2007 found that a device associated with Christian Bruckner was active in the Praia da Luz area during the relevant time window. The records showed the device connecting to local cell towers in a pattern that was consistent with movement in and around the village. This placed Bruckner, or at least, the device associated with him, in the vicinity of the crime scene on the night the crime was committed. Phone evidence of this kind is rarely conclusive on its own. Defense attorneys are skilled at challenging cell tower evidence, raising questions about the range of individual towers, the possibility of device sharing, and the limitations of cell site analysis as a precise locating tool. But as one element of a broader evidentiary picture, it is significant, and it is the kind of specific, data-driven evidence that modern juries are generally capable of understanding and weighing. The second category of evidence that has been publicly described involves communications that Bruckner allegedly sent or participated in that were recovered by investigators. The specific nature of these communications has not been fully disclosed, again for entirely appropriate reasons related to the integrity of ongoing proceedings, but prosecutors in Germany have described material that they regard as highly probative. Reports in the German press, based on information disclosed during separate legal proceedings involving Bruckner, suggested that he had made statements to others about the McCann case that went well beyond what an innocent person would be expected to know or to say. The third category involves witness testimony, and this is both the most potentially powerful and the most legally complex element of the case. Eyewitness testimony in criminal cases is always subject to the inherent limitations of human memory and perception, and those limitations are compounded when the testimony relates to events observed briefly, in poor light, from a distance, many years before the point at which the witness is asked to make a formal account. The witnesses who reported seeing a man carrying a child near the Ocean Club on the evening of May 3, 2007, the British family whose accounts formed the basis of the artist impressions released by Operation Grange in 2013, provided descriptions that investigators have found consistent with Bruckner's appearance at the relevant time. The physical description of the man, his apparent age, his build, the way he was carrying the child, these details, reported independently by multiple witnesses who did not know each other, created a composite that pointed investigators in a consistent direction. Whether these witnesses can, in a courtroom setting, identify Bruckner as the man they saw remains a question that only the formal process of prosecution and trial can resolve. Memory is malleable, and the passage of nearly 2 decades creates enormous challenges for any identification evidence. Experienced defense attorneys would examine these witnesses rigorously, probing the reliability and the consistency of their accounts, challenging the conditions under which their observations were made and the circumstances under which their accounts were recorded. There is also, in the background of the evidential architecture, the broader pattern of Bruckner's known criminal history and his physical proximity to the scene of multiple offenses involving sexual violence over a period of years. Investigators and prosecutors work within strict legal rules about the admissibility of evidence of prior conduct, and those rules exist for very good reasons. The fact that a person has committed offenses in the past does not prove that they committed any particular offense in the present. But prior conduct evidence, where it is admissible under applicable rules, can be powerful in establishing a pattern that supports the prosecution's broader narrative. In Bruckner's case, the 2005 rape of the 72-year-old American woman, committed not far from Praia de Luz, 2 years before Madeleine McCann's disappearance, establishes that he was willing and capable of committing serious violent and sexual offenses against the most vulnerable people, in the precise geographic area where the McCann disappearance occurred. The proximity in time and place is something that any jury considering the McCann case would need to grapple with. The investigators have also explored the question of the crime scene itself with great thoroughness. The apartment, the window, the side passageway, the route from the apartment to the surrounding streets, all of this has been mapped and remapped, digitally reconstructed, analyzed in terms of the time and the logistics required for a person to approach the building, enter through the window, and exit with a child, and reach a point where they could no longer be seen from the restaurant terrace where the adults in the group were sitting. The results of this analysis have not been made fully public, but investigators have stated that the scenario of an abduction from the window is consistent with the physical evidence, with the witness accounts, and with the timing as reconstructed from the various adult check-ins on the children throughout the evening. A person who knew the layout of the resort, who had observed the patterns of the adults in the group, who had identified the apartment and its occupants, could have accomplished the abduction within the window of time that was available. The weight of investigative opinion, based on what has been publicly described, appears to favor the conclusion that there was at least some element of prior observation, that the person responsible had spent time in the vicinity of the resort, had become aware of the family's routine, and had identified the apartment as accessible and the adults as temporarily absent. Whether this constitutes full premeditation or a more informal kind of predatory opportunism is a question that goes to the center of the case's moral and legal reckoning. Part 6: The German Legal Labyrinth. By 2020, when German prosecutors made their public announcement naming Christian Bruckner as a suspect, the investigative picture had reached a point of significant development. But the identification of a prime suspect and the successful prosecution of that suspect are separated by a vast and complicated legal terrain, and in the case of Christian Bruckner, that terrain was, and remains, exceptionally challenging. German prosecutors, under the leadership of Hans Christian Wolters, the lead prosecutor in Braunschweig who was responsible for the Bruckner case in Germany, pursued their own independent inquiry with energy and with evident conviction about Bruckner's guilt. Wolters made numerous public statements about the case, including his assertion that he was certain Madeline was dead and that Bruckner was responsible, statements that were remarkable for their directness and that reflected the confidence of his team in their evidential position. But the German system of criminal law requires a very specific evidentiary foundation before charges can be formally brought. German prosecutors do not operate on the same probable cause standard that applies in common law jurisdictions like England and Wales or the United States. The German system requires that prosecutors be able to demonstrate, before an examining magistrate, that there is sufficient evidence to justify trial, and the threshold for that demonstration, while not the same as proof beyond reasonable doubt at trial, is nonetheless demanding. Prosecutor Wolters and his team, for all of their stated confidence, found themselves unable to reach that threshold with the evidence that they had assembled by the time Bruckner's existing prison sentence was due to expire. This was a critical juncture in the case, and it created an acute legal problem. If Bruckner could not be charged, he would be released. And once released, the legal leverage that his imprisonment provided, including the ability to keep him within German jurisdiction, would evaporate. In the event, Bruckner was not released as expected. In a development that reflected the complex interplay between multiple prosecutions and the German legal system, his detention continued beyond the expiration of his rape sentence, connected to separate investigative proceedings. He faced charges in Germany related to alleged sexual offenses against other individuals in Portugal during the period of his residence there, offenses unrelated to the McCann case, but part of the broader picture of his criminal conduct during his years in the Algarve. These separate proceedings, which went to trial in Braunschweig in 2024, added a new layer of complexity to the already extraordinarily complex legal situation surrounding Bruckner. The trial addressed allegations made by a number of women who described sexual offenses committed against them by Bruckner in Portugal in the years around the McCann disappearance. The proceedings were conducted with the kind of careful attention to the legal rights of the accused that the German system demands, and they attracted enormous international media attention. The outcome of those German proceedings was a significant setback for prosecutors. In May of 2025, the Braunschweig court acquitted Christian Bruckner of the charges brought against him in that particular case. The court found that the prosecution had not presented sufficient evidence to prove the charges beyond reasonable doubt. Bruckner, who had maintained his innocence throughout, was acquitted. The acquittal did not, as some media coverage suggested, mean that Bruckner had been cleared of involvement in Madeleine McCann's disappearance. The McCann case was not before the Braunschweig court. The acquittal related specifically to the charges in those proceedings. But it was nonetheless a significant development, and it raised serious questions about the overall strength of the prosecutorial case against Bruckner and about the pathway to accountability in the McCann matter. German law, as has been widely reported in the coverage of this case, presents particular challenges for any attempt to bring Bruckner to trial outside Germany. The German constitution, the Basic Law, contains provisions that restrict the extradition of German nationals to non-European Union countries. Since Brexit, the United Kingdom is no longer an EU member state, and the European arrest warrant mechanism, which previously provided a relatively streamlined pathway for transferring criminal suspects between EU members, no longer applies between the UK and Germany. This constitutional constraint is not absolute, and there are legal mechanisms through which German nationals can be transferred to face trial in non-EU jurisdictions, but those mechanisms are demanding and have rarely been invoked in practice. Any British request for the extradition of Christian Bruckner to face trial in the United Kingdom would trigger a complex legal and diplomatic process, potentially involving challenges before German courts up to and including the Federal Constitutional Court, and potentially requiring political engagement at the highest levels of both governments. The alternative legal pathways that British and international prosecutors have considered include the possibility of prosecution in Portugal, where the crime was committed. Portugal, as an EU member state, has a different relationship with Germany under European law, including a different framework for mutual legal assistance and the potential transfer of criminal proceedings. Portugal reopened its own investigation into the McCann case in parallel with the British inquiry, and the Portuguese authorities have been actively involved in the evidentiary work of recent years. A Portuguese prosecution would have its own advantages and disadvantages. Portuguese law would apply, Portuguese evidentiary standards would govern the proceedings, and the physical location of the crime would mean that much of the relevant evidence, the crime scene, the witnesses, the broader context, was within Portuguese jurisdiction. But Portuguese prosecution would also depend on the transfer of evidence from Germany and the cooperation of German authorities, and it would mean conducting the proceedings in a different legal tradition from the one in which the British investigators have been operating. The Metropolitan Police, aware of all of these complexities, has been working to ensure that the evidential case they are building is of sufficient quality and comprehensiveness to support prosecution in whatever jurisdiction ultimately proves viable. This requires an unusually high degree of coordination between legal systems that operate on different principles, and it reflects a level of institutional commitment to the McCann case that has been sustained across multiple government administrations and multiple police leadership teams. Part 7. The Families at the Center. It would be possible, and perhaps, from a certain professional distance, it might even seem appropriate, to discuss the Madeleine McCann case entirely in terms of legal proceedings, evidentiary standards, and jurisdictional complexities. These are, after all, the mechanisms through which justice is sought and delivered, and understanding them is essential to understanding where the case stands. But any account of this case that fails to keep at its center the humanity of the people most directly affected by it would be incomplete in a way that matters deeply. Kate and Jerry McCann have lived, for nearly 20 years, with a particular kind of unresolved grief that most of us will never be asked to experience. The grief of a parent who does not know what has become of their child is not the grief of bereavement, which, however terrible, carries within it the certainty of loss and the possibility of a beginning, over time, of a new kind of equilibrium. It is a different and in some ways more consuming grief, a grief that does not permit resolution, that opens every morning with the same unanswered question, that transforms every ordinary childhood sight, a girl of a certain age, a certain color hair, a certain way of moving, into a fresh encounter with absence. Kate McCann wrote a book about her experience, published in 2011. Its title was simply her daughter's name. It was a book that combined the practical details of the investigation with the raw, unguarded expression of a parent's loss, and it communicated, more effectively than any forensic analysis could, the lived reality of what it means to search for a missing child across years of hope and disappointment and frustration. She wrote about the nights when the darkness felt absolute. About the mornings when she would wake for a fraction of a second before remembering, and how that fraction of a second of not remembering was both the best and the worst moment of every day. About the way that the investigation consumed everything: time, energy, financial resources, privacy, the ordinary fabric of family life that parents of young children take for granted, while offering no certainty of ever providing the answer she needed. The McCanns have 2 other children, twins, born before Madeline, who were 2 years old on the night of their sister's disappearance. These children, now young adults, have grown up entirely within the shadow of the case. They have had to make sense of an absence that they did not fully understand as infants, and that has shaped their entire lives. They have had to navigate, in the public scrutiny that follows the family, the particular cruelty of being asked to define themselves in relation to a tragedy that they did not choose and cannot escape. The McCann family has also had to spend years defending themselves against the theory, advanced by Goncalo Amaral in his book and in various media, and believed by a significant minority of the public, that they were responsible for Madeline's death. This theory, which the Portuguese authorities themselves ultimately rejected, and which every credible investigative analysis has found no evidential support for, nonetheless persisted in certain corners of the internet and the tabloid media with a tenacity that speaks to something troubling about the way we sometimes respond to the pain of others. In 2019, the European Court of Human Rights ruled in the McCanns' favor in their long-running legal battle with Goncalo Amaral over his book. The court found that Amaral's continued republication of his unfounded theory, after the Portuguese courts had ordered it stopped, violated the family's right to private and family life. It was a legal vindication, but vindication of that kind offers cold comfort to parents who have been living for over a decade under a cloud of public suspicion. Through all of this, the legal battles, the media storms, the years of investigation that progressed and then stalled and then progressed again, the McCanns have maintained, with a consistency that speaks either to extraordinary strength of character or to the particular kind of clarity that comes from knowing the truth, that their daughter was taken. That somewhere, in the events of that evening in May 2007, there is an answer that can be found. And that the people responsible for finding it must not stop until they do. In 2026, the Metropolitan Police have not stopped. And the publicly stated goal of bringing charges before the 20th anniversary of Madeline's disappearance, before May of 2027, gives the current phase of the investigation a timeline and an urgency that was not always present in the long middle years of the case. Part 8, Operation Grange in 2026, the current state of play. As of the spring of 2026, the investigation into Madeline McCann's disappearance has reached what investigators and legal analysts describe as a critical juncture. The Metropolitan Police, working through Operation Grange, have been engaged in intensive preparatory work aimed at assembling a prosecution case that meets the standard required by the Crown Prosecution Service for the initiation of charges. The CPS test for charging decisions is well established in English law. Before authorizing charges, the CPS must be satisfied that there is sufficient evidence to provide a realistic prospect of conviction, meaning that an objective, impartial analysis of the evidence suggests that a reasonable jury, properly directed, would be more likely than not to convict. This is the evidential stage of the test. There is also a public interest stage, which in a case of this gravity and public significance would clearly be satisfied. The evidential threshold, in a case as complex and as long-running as the McCann investigation, is the challenge that the investigators have been working to meet. They believe, based on what we can piece together from authorized disclosures and informed reporting, that they are now in a position to put a case to the CPS that meets that threshold. The Metropolitan Police's strategy, as it has been described in broad terms, involves what might be characterized as a belt and suspenders approach to the jurisdictional problem. They are simultaneously preparing a case for potential prosecution in the United Kingdom, which would require the extradition of Bruckner from Germany, and working with Portuguese authorities on the possibility of a prosecution in Portugal, and maintaining a parallel engagement with German prosecutors who retain the authority to bring their own case under German law. The extradition route presents, as we have discussed, very significant legal obstacles. But the investigators and their legal advisors believe that those obstacles are not necessarily insurmountable. Germany's constitution restricts but does not absolutely prohibit the transfer of German nationals to face justice in other jurisdictions. The specific constitutional provisions, and the German case law that has developed around them, leave open pathways that experienced legal advocates are exploring. One avenue that has been discussed by legal experts analyzing the case is the possibility of applying for extradition not directly from Germany to the UK, but through a mechanism that involves Portugal, since Portugal is an EU member state. The framework for mutual legal assistance and judicial cooperation between Germany and Portugal is considerably more favorable than the framework between Germany and the post-Brexit United Kingdom. If Portugal were to request Bruckner's transfer to face charges in Portuguese courts, the legal obstacles would be somewhat different in character, though not necessarily easier to overcome in practice. The German position in all of this is nuanced and, to some extent, opaque. German prosecutors, who have invested significant resources in their own investigation and who publicly named Bruckner as a suspect 6 years ago, clearly have a substantial institutional interest in seeing the case resolved. But they are also operating within a constitutional and legal framework that constrains their options, and they are subject to political considerations that bear on any decision to cooperate with British authorities in a manner that might raise issues under German fundamental law. There are reports that the relationship between the Metropolitan Police and their German counterparts has been productive and cooperative at a practical investigative level, whatever the legal and diplomatic complexities. Investigators from Operation Grange have traveled to Germany, met with their German counterparts, shared evidence, and coordinated their analytical work. The two teams, while working within different legal frameworks and toward objectives that are not always perfectly aligned, have maintained a professional partnership that has advanced both investigations. One area that legal analysts have pointed to as potentially significant is the development of forensic science since 2007. In the nearly 20 years since Madeleine McCann's disappearance, the capabilities of forensic science, particularly in the areas of low-template DNA analysis, digital forensics, and the analysis of communication intercepts, have advanced dramatically. Evidence that could not be meaningfully analyzed in 2007, or that produced inconclusive results with the technology available at the time, may be capable of yielding clearer results with contemporary methods. The original forensic work on the McCann case, which was conducted by the Forensic Science Service in the UK, an organization that was subsequently disbanded, produced results that were characterized by the lead scientist as inconclusive. The samples in question, however, were preserved. And preserved samples, subjected to modern analytical techniques, can sometimes yield results that the original analysis could not. Whether this has occurred in the McCann case is not publicly known, but it represents a possibility that investigators would certainly have explored. Part 9, Building a case, the prosecution challenge. Understanding what the prosecution of Christian Bruckner would look like, what the Crown's case would present to a jury, how the defense would respond, what the decisive points of contest would be, requires a careful analysis of what is publicly known about the evidence, combined with an understanding of how criminal prosecutions work in practice. Let us start from the position that the investigators have publicly suggested, that the evidence is approaching, or has reached, the threshold for a realistic prospect of conviction. What does that case look like in outline? The prosecution's case, as it can be reconstructed from the public record, would likely rest on several interlocking pillars. The first, and in some ways the most straightforward, is opportunity, the phone evidence placing Bruckner in the Praia da Luz area on the night of May 3, 2007. This evidence, while subject to the limitations we have discussed, establishes that the suspect was in the right place at the right time. The second pillar is means, Bruckner's physical capability to have entered the apartment and removed Madeline, combined with the evidence of his familiarity with the area and his access to a vehicle capable of transporting a child. His motorhome, his knowledge of the local roads, his established pattern of movement through the region, all of this speaks to means. The third pillar is disposition, the evidence of Bruckner's prior offending, to the extent that it is admissible under applicable rules of evidence, that establishes a pattern of predatory behavior toward the most vulnerable. The 2005 rape committed near Praia da Luz, the pattern of offending in Germany both before and after his time in Portugal, this evidence speaks to a person who was capable of committing the offense that the prosecution would allege. The fourth pillar, and potentially the most powerful, is the alleged communications evidence. If investigators have access to material in which Bruckner made statements about the McKen case that demonstrated knowledge inconsistent with innocence, or that constituted something more direct, this could be the decisive element of the prosecution case. Communications evidence of this kind, properly authenticated, carefully presented, has been the linchpin of numerous successful prosecutions in complex cases. Against this, the defense would deploy its own set of arguments. They would challenge the reliability of the cell tower evidence, pointing to the limitations of precision and the possibility of alternative explanations. They would challenge the admissibility and probative value of the prior offending evidence. They would scrutinize the provenance and the reliability of any communications evidence. They would probe the credibility and the reliability of eyewitness accounts made nearly 20 years before trial. They would also, and this is a significant consideration, raise the question of what happened to Madeline's body. In the absence of physical remains, the prosecution must prove not only that Bruckner committed an offense against her, but that she is in fact dead. The German prosecutor's public statement that he is certain Madeline is dead reflects an assessment of the evidence as it currently stands, but proving death without a body is a challenge that prosecutors have confronted in other cases and have, in some instances, met successfully. Cases in England and Wales, including the well-known cases of Harold Shipman and the later prosecution of Peter Tobin, demonstrate that courts can be satisfied of death in the absence of physical remains where the circumstantial evidence is sufficiently compelling. The precedent of no-body murder prosecutions is well established in English law and in the laws of most mature legal systems. But they are demanding, and they require the prosecution to construct a case that convinces a jury to an exacting standard without the foundational physical evidence that most murder prosecutions can rely on. There is also the question of what charge, precisely, would be brought. In English law, a prosecution for the abduction and murder of Madeleine McCann would likely involve a charge of murder under the common law, with the abduction potentially charged as a separate offense or as part of the same criminous act. The specific framing of the charges matters, because it determines the elements that the prosecution must prove and the defenses that are available to the accused. Investigators are aware of all of these challenges. The public statements from Scotland Yard about the state of the evidence are not the statements of people who believe they have an easy case. They are the statements of experienced professionals who have spent years building the strongest possible evidential foundation and who believe, at this juncture, that the foundation is sufficient to support a prosecution. The judgment of whether that belief is correct will ultimately rest with the Crown Prosecution Service and, if charges are brought, with a jury. Part 10: The Missing Child. Who was Madeleine McCann? In the long course of an investigation like this one, consumed as it inevitably is by the mechanics of evidence and law and international legal procedure, it is possible, even for people who care deeply about the outcome, to lose sight of the person at the center of it. To forget that behind every document and every piece of phone data and every legal argument, there is a human being whose life was interrupted on a spring evening and who deserves to be remembered as a person, not just as a case. Madeleine Beth McCann was born on the 12th of May, 2003, at Addenbrooke's Hospital in Cambridge, England. She was the first child of Kate and Jerry McCann, who had met while both were studying medicine and who had built a life together that was, by all accounts, full of warmth and purpose and ordinary happiness. She was a healthy, lively, talkative child, curious about the world in the way that 3-year-olds are, when everything is still new and the boundaries between magic and reality are wonderfully permeable. People who knew the family described her as a child with a strong personality. She was verbal and expressive, with a wide vocabulary for her age and an ability to make herself understood that her parents found both charming and, occasionally, challenging. She had a coloboma, a small distinguishing mark, in the right iris of her right eye, a condition that creates a slight irregularity in the otherwise circular boundary between the colored and non-colored portions of the eye. This feature became one of the most well-known physical identifying characteristics of any missing person in the world, reproduced on posters and alerts across dozens of countries in the years after her disappearance. She had a close relationship with her twin siblings, who were nearly 2 years younger and who were born in 2005. She was, by the accounts of everyone who knew the family, loved deeply and cared for with attentiveness and devotion. She was 4 days away from her 4th birthday on the night she disappeared. 4 days. She would have been turning 24 years old in May of 2027, the 20th anniversary of her disappearance. It is one of the painful exercises that parents in the McCann family's situation sometimes engage in, the imagining of what a child would have become, the extrapolation from the small person they knew to the adult they never got to see. She would have been a young adult now. She would have had her own experiences and her own choices and her own life, building outward from the foundation of the family that loved her. Instead, she exists in the public imagination as she was on the night she disappeared, a small blonde girl in light-colored pajamas, the image on the posters, the face that became the most recognized missing child in history. This is not justice. This is not the way a human being should be remembered. But it is the reality that the case has created, and it is a reality that the people who are working to resolve the case carry with them every day. The investigators who have spent years working Operation Grange are, by the accounts of those who know them, well aware of this dimension of the case. The best investigators in cases of this kind are driven not merely by professional obligation, though professional obligation is real and important, but by a genuine sense of moral responsibility toward the victim and toward the people who loved her. The commitment to reaching the 20th anniversary with charges filed is not a bureaucratic deadline. It is a commitment made, implicitly and perhaps explicitly, to a family that has been waiting for nearly 20 years. And it is a commitment made, too, to the memory of a small girl who deserves better than to remain forever unresolved. Part 11, The International Dimension, Diplomacy, Law, and Justice. The pursuit of justice in the McCann case has, from the beginning, been an exercise in navigating the extraordinary complexity of international law and international relations. It has required cooperation between police forces operating under different legal frameworks, in different languages, with different institutional cultures and different definitions of evidentiary sufficiency. It has required legal analysis of constitutional provisions, treaty obligations, and bilateral agreements that most of the lawyers involved in the case had rarely had occasion to consider before. And it has required a sustained diplomatic engagement between governments that have, in the nearly 20 years since Madeline's disappearance, had a significantly shifting relationship with each other. The United Kingdom's departure from the European Union, which became legally effective at the beginning of 2020, the same year that Bruckner was publicly named as a suspect, fundamentally altered the legal architecture within which British authorities pursue criminal matters involving EU member states. The European arrest warrant, which had allowed for the relatively efficient transfer of criminal suspects between EU members, no longer applies to the UK. In its place is a patchwork of bilateral arrangements and treaty provisions that is significantly more cumbersome and significantly more uncertain. For the McCann case specifically, this means that any British request for Bruckner's extradition to face trial in the United Kingdom must navigate both the general post-Brexit framework for UK-Germany legal cooperation and the specific constitutional constraints imposed by Germany's Basic Law. The combination of these two obstacles makes the extradition route to a UK trial the most legally challenging of the available options. German constitutional law in this area has a specific and somewhat unusual character that is worth explaining in some detail, because it goes to the heart of the problem. Article 16 of the German Basic Law provides that no German citizen may be extradited to a foreign country. This provision was inserted into Germany's post-war constitution with deliberate intent. It reflects the historical experience of German nationals being delivered to foreign powers under circumstances that involved the abuse of legal process. And it represents a constitutional guarantee that German citizens would be entitled to the protection of German justice rather than being subjected to foreign legal systems over which Germany had no oversight. The provision, however, has been modified by constitutional amendment in the context of European Union law. Since 2000, German citizens may be extradited to other EU member states pursuant to the European Arrest Warrant framework, but this exception applies specifically to EU member states, and the United Kingdom, following Brexit, is no longer one. The extradition of a German citizen to the United Kingdom would therefore engage the original, unamended prohibition in Article 16, and overcoming that prohibition in any particular case would require either a constitutional amendment, which is politically complex and constitutionally demanding, or a judicial interpretation that found some basis for distinguishing the prohibition in the specific circumstances. Legal experts who have analyzed the constitutional question are divided on whether a pathway to extradition exists under current law, and if so, what form it would take. Some argue that Germany's treaty obligations under international human rights law, including obligations to cooperate in the prosecution of serious crimes, might provide a basis for courts to find that Article 16, correctly interpreted, does not prohibit extradition where the justice system of the requesting country meets applicable standards. Others argue that the provision is essentially absolute in the post-Brexit context, and that no extradition to the UK is possible without a constitutional amendment. This legal uncertainty is one of the reasons that the Metropolitan Police and their legal advisors have been careful to describe the extradition route as one of several options rather than as the only pathway to prosecution. The Portuguese option, prosecution in the country where the crime was committed, avoids the constitutional impasse with Article 16, because Germany's obligation to cooperate with Portugal under EU law remains intact. A Portuguese prosecution request, backed by evidence assembled by British investigators and endorsed by Portuguese authorities, would engage a different and potentially more tractable legal mechanism. The practical challenge with the Portuguese option is that it requires Portugal to take ownership of the prosecution in a way that aligns with Portuguese law and Portuguese evidentiary standards, while also incorporating the evidence that British investigators have spent years developing. This is not an insuperable problem. Cooperation of this kind between European prosecutors is envisaged under EU law, but it requires careful coordination and a degree of institutional trust and mutual confidence that takes time to build. There is also the possibility, which German authorities have never entirely foreclosed, that German prosecutors might ultimately develop a sufficient case to bring charges in Germany. German law has jurisdiction over serious crimes committed abroad by German nationals in certain circumstances, and it also has jurisdiction over crimes committed against German nationals abroad. Madeleine McCann was British, not German, which complicates this basis for jurisdiction. But German law's long-arm provisions, and the general principle of universal jurisdiction over the most serious crimes, might provide avenues that German legal scholars have analyzed. In practice, the German prosecution option depends on German prosecutors reaching the evidentiary threshold that has so far eluded them. The acquittal in the 2025 Braunschweig case was a setback that, while directly relevant only to the specific charges in that case, raised questions about the overall strength of the evidentiary package available to German investigators. Whether additional evidence developed in cooperation with British investigators might change the calculus is a question that only the investigators themselves can answer. The diplomatic dimension of the case has been managed, over the years, with a combination of formal engagement and careful informality. British ministers have raised the case with their German counterparts in bilateral discussions. The German government, for its part, has maintained a consistent position that they support the investigation and want to see justice achieved, while being appropriately cautious about making any representations that might be seen as prejudging the outcome of legal proceedings or as interfering with the independence of the judiciary. The relationship between the UK and Germany, notwithstanding the significant changes introduced by Brexit, remains fundamentally cooperative in the domain of law enforcement and criminal justice. The two countries share intelligence, cooperate on counter-terrorism, and have extensive bilateral arrangements for legal assistance that predate both Brexit and the EU itself. This underlying foundation of cooperation provides the practical basis for the ongoing collaboration between British and German investigators, even in the absence of the formal EU frameworks that Brexit removed. Part 12, Toward Resolution, The Road to 2027. We have traveled a long road tonight. We have moved through the geography of a Portuguese holiday village in the spring of 2007, through the frantic early hours of a child's disappearance, through the years of a Portuguese investigation that struggled under the weight of its own contradictions, through the reinvigoration of the case by the Metropolitan Police's Operation Grange, through the profile of a German suspect with a long and troubling criminal history, through the architecture of the evidence and the labyrinth of international law. And we arrive here, in the spring of 2026, at a moment that investigators are describing, carefully, professionally, without the hyperbole that this case has sometimes attracted from others, as a critical juncture. A moment when the long patient work of years is approaching what may, if the legal obstacles can be overcome, be its decisive phase. This is the language of investigators who believe they are close. It is not the language of certainty. These are experienced professionals who know better than to predict the outcome of complex legal proceedings, but it is the language of genuine conviction about the strength of their position. The most sensitive aspects of the request. This process, in a case of this complexity, could take months or even years to complete. If the Portuguese route is pursued in parallel, or as an alternative, a similar timeline applies. Portuguese prosecutors would need to be satisfied that the evidence supports charges under Portuguese law. The transfer of criminal proceedings from Germany to Portugal, if that is the mechanism used, involves its own legal requirements. Coordination between British, Portuguese, and German authorities would need to reach a level of alignment that has not yet been publicly described as achieved. And through all of this, Christian Bruckner remains a living person with legal rights. He is presumed innocent under the law of every jurisdiction that might consider prosecuting him, until and unless a court finds otherwise after a fair trial. His defense lawyers, who have been active and vocal throughout the proceedings in Germany, will contest every step of any prosecution process, as is their professional obligation and his legal right. The principle of the presumption of innocence is not merely a procedural nicety, it is the foundation of any legitimate justice system, and its application to Bruckner, however difficult that may feel to those who believe his guilt to be established, is non-negotiable. This is, perhaps, the most difficult aspect of cases like this one for the public to absorb. The families of victims, and the many members of the public who have followed this case for years and who have formed their own views about what happened and who is responsible, often find the slow and procedurally careful pace of formal justice deeply frustrating. They see evidence that seems overwhelming to them. They see a man who has been publicly named by multiple law enforcement agencies across multiple countries as the prime suspect. They see a family that has been waiting for 19 years. And they ask, why is this taking so long? Why hasn't he been charged? Why isn't he in court? The answer to those questions lies in precisely the principles that make the justice system trustworthy. The standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt, the requirement that a jury be certain, not merely persuaded, of a defendant's guilt before they convict, exists because the consequences of wrongful conviction are catastrophic and irreversible. The procedural protections that defendants enjoy, the rules about admissible evidence, the right to confront witnesses and challenge the prosecution case, these exist because a justice system that abandons those protections in the pursuit of a result it is already certain of has ceased to be a justice system and has become something else entirely. The investigators who are building the case against Christian Bruckner understand this better than anyone. They have spent years working within these constraints, not because the constraints are comfortable or convenient, but because those constraints are what give the eventual outcome its legitimacy. A conviction obtained through a fair trial, with all of the defendant's rights respected and all of the evidence properly tested, is a finding that stands. A conviction obtained through shortcuts or by the disregard of fundamental principles is always vulnerable to the challenge that it does not represent genuine justice. There is one more dimension of this case that deserves careful attention before we draw toward our conclusion, and that is the question of what resolution, assuming it comes, will actually mean for the people most directly affected. For Kate and Jerry McCann, and for the twins who have grown up in the shadow of their sister's disappearance, the resolution of the case will not bring Madeline back. Nothing can do that. The arrest and prosecution and conviction, assuming all of those things occur, of the person responsible will answer the question of what happened and who did it, and it will provide the formal acknowledgement that Madeline's life was precious and her death was a crime that the law recognized and responded to. That is not nothing. That is in fact very important. But it is not the same as having her back, and the people who love her have always known the difference. What it would provide, and this is not a small thing, is the end of uncertainty. The particular agony of not knowing what happened is, by many accounts, one of the most enduring elements of the grief that the family has carried. The theories and the speculation and the tabloid accusations and the internet discussions have all added to that agony, because they have meant that the uncertainty exists not just within the family's private grief but in the public domain, where it is constantly revisited and re-examined and sometimes distorted. Resolution would close that particular chapter in a definitive way that the passage of time alone can never accomplish. It would also mean that Madeline McCann could be remembered differently. Not as a mystery, not as a case, not as the subject of speculation, but as a person. A daughter. A sister. A little girl who loved her family and who deserved a different fate. That reframing, from case to person, is something that her family has sought throughout these nearly 20 years, and it is something that a resolved prosecution could finally allow. For the investigators who have given years of their professional lives to Operation Grange, resolution would represent the fulfillment of a commitment that has been renewed, through multiple leadership teams and multiple government administrations, since 2011. The officers who have worked this case have done so with a seriousness and a dedication that deserves recognition. They have worked in the knowledge that the world was watching, that every development would be scrutinized and reported and debated, and that the stakes of their work, for the McCann family, for the integrity of British law enforcement, for the cause of justice in one of the most prominent cases in the country's history, were extraordinary. For the international community of investigators and legal scholars who have followed the case, resolution would provide important precedents in several areas of law that the case has brought to prominence. The questions of cross-border criminal prosecution, of the use of digital evidence spanning nearly 2 decades, of constitutional limitations on extradition in the post-Brexit European legal landscape, these are not merely questions that matter in the McCann case. They are questions that will shape the framework for international criminal cooperation for years to come. How this case is resolved, and through what legal mechanisms, will be studied by lawyers and prosecutors in multiple countries. And for the broader public, the many millions of people who have followed this case since 2007, who have contributed to tip lines and fund campaigns and kept the case in their awareness through nearly 2 decades of life, resolution would provide something that is harder to name but no less real. The sense that even in the most difficult cases, even when the obstacles seem insurmountable, even when years and jurisdictions and constitutional provisions and legal complexities multiply to a degree that seems to foreclose any possibility of justice. Even then, it is possible to reach an accounting. It is possible for the mechanisms of law and the determination of investigators to ultimately prevail. That is not a naive belief. It is not a reassuring fairy tale designed to comfort a public that has been disturbed by an uncomfortable reality. It is a statement about what dedicated, rigorous, patient investigative and legal work can accomplish. And the people at Operation Grange, in the spring of 2026, are working every day toward demonstrating that it is true. Let us consider what the months ahead are likely to bring, to the extent that informed analysis allows us to say anything useful about the timeline. The immediate focus of the investigation, based on all available information, is the preparation of a detailed evidential submission to the Crown Prosecution Service. This submission will compile the totality of the evidence that Operation Grange has assembled: digital evidence, witness statements, forensic analysis, intelligence products, prior conduct evidence, into a comprehensive package that the CPS can evaluate against the full code test for charging decisions. If the CPS authorizes charges, the next step is the formal initiation of extradition proceedings or, alternatively, the engagement of Portuguese or German judicial authorities in the prosecution process. The specific route chosen will depend on the CPS's assessment of which jurisdiction provides the best prospect of a successful trial, taking into account the legal obstacles in each pathway. If extradition proceedings are initiated, they will be contested. Bruckner's lawyers have demonstrated throughout the German proceedings that they are capable and aggressive advocates who will use every available legal argument to protect their client's position. An extradition request from the UK to Germany will face challenges at every stage of the German legal process, and those challenges may take considerable time to resolve. And there remains the possibility that the legal and diplomatic machinery produces a result more quickly than the pessimists would predict. International criminal cooperation, when it is driven by sufficient political will and supported by a sufficiently strong evidential case, can sometimes move with surprising speed. The history of cases that seemed legally intractable, cases where constitutional barriers and jurisdictional complications appeared to make prosecution impossible, is also a history of determined advocates finding unexpected pathways through apparently impassable terrain. The investigators believe they have the evidence. They are working on assembling the legal mechanism to deploy it. And they are doing so with the kind of quiet, determined professionalism that has characterized Operation Grange throughout its 15-year existence. In the village of Praia da Luz, life goes on in the way that it does in places that have been marked by tragedy. Visitors still come, drawn by the beauty of the coastline and the warmth of the climate. The Ocean Club still operates, though it has been renamed and rebranded in the years since 2007. The streets that were once crowded with investigators and journalists and camera crews are quiet now, except in the summer months when the tourists arrive and the village returns to the busy, sunlit existence that was its character before that night in May. But there is still, in that place, the shadow that we spoke of at the beginning of our journey tonight. The particular kind of darkness that settles over a place where something terrible has happened. The absence that gives the light its different quality. The locals know it. The returning holidaymakers sense it. And the family of a little girl who turned 3 years and 11 months old in that village, and who has not been seen since, carry it with them every day, wherever they are. The investigation continues. The clock moves toward May 2027. And somewhere in the mechanisms of law and international diplomacy and forensic science and human determination, the effort to answer the question that has defined nearly 20 years is reaching what may, what must, for the sake of justice and of memory and of a family's enduring love, be its final chapter. The story of Madeleine McCann is not, as of this writing, a story with an ending. It is a story in progress. It is a story that the investigators and the prosecutors and the legal advocates and, above all, the family are working every day to bring to its conclusion. We do not know what that conclusion will look like. We do not know whether the extradition will succeed, whether the prosecution will be brought in the UK or Portugal or Germany, whether the evidence will be found sufficient for conviction. We do not know whether Madeleine's remains will ever be found, whether the full circumstances of what happened on that spring evening will ever be established to a legal standard, whether the family will ever have the definitive accounting that they have sought. What we know is this. A child is gone. A family has endured. An investigation has persisted. And the people responsible for seeking justice have not given up. In the end, perhaps, that persistence is the most important thing to understand about this case. Not the evidence, not the legal arguments, not the constitutional provisions or the diplomatic negotiations or the forensic analysis. The persistence. The refusal, through 19 years of frustration and setback and hope renewed and hope deferred, to stop asking the question that demands an answer. What happened to Madeleine McCann? The investigation continues. And in that continuation, in that daily, patient, professionally rigorous act of continuing, there is a kind of answer. Not the answer the family needs. Not yet. But something important. Something that speaks to the capacity of human institutions, at their best, to honor the obligation they owe to the most vulnerable and to the people who loved them. We will continue to watch. We will continue to report. And when there is more to tell, we will be here. Closing meditation. There are cases that change the people who follow them. Cases whose details and whose human stakes become part of something you carry with you, not as burden exactly, but as awareness. As a reminder of what is at stake when we ask institutions built from human hands to meet the demands of human tragedy. The case of Madeleine McCann is one of those cases. Not because of the attention it has received, though the attention has been extraordinary. Not because of the complexity of the legal landscape, though that complexity is genuine and significant. But because at the center of it is something irreducibly simple and irreducibly heartbreaking, a child who should be alive, and a family that has spent nearly 20 years refusing to stop looking for answers. There is courage in that refusal. There is a particular kind of love, the kind that does not calculate the cost or weigh the toll of continued engagement against the comfort of withdrawal, in the determination to keep asking, to keep pushing, to keep meeting every setback with renewed resolve. Tonight, as you settle into the quiet, carry that with you. Not the darkness of the case, not the details of the investigation, but the thing underneath it all, the love that drives the search, the professionalism that sustains the investigation, the possibility that even in the most difficult circumstances, justice can still be found. The world is full of unresolved things. Cases that remain open, questions that have not been answered, absences that have not been explained. But it is also full of people who are working, quietly and methodically and without giving up, to change that. To provide the answers. To close the open wounds that unresolved cases leave behind. Hold on to that thought as the night settles around you. The work goes on. The search continues. And in that continuing, there is something that we might, carefully and without sentimentality, call hope. Sleep well. We will be here when you return. If you're still awake after that, subscribe, leave a like, and drop a comment. Which case should we cover next?